What's the creepiest thing that's ever happened to you or someone you know? Story 1. I was midway through a 12-hour road trip alone, driving all my college apartment stuff back to my parents' house. The car was totally overpacked with boxes, a bike, a keyboard, and the like. I was very low on gas, so I pulled over to a gas station in the middle of nowhere in Georgia. The sun was dipping low, and the gas station was empty, just off the side of the main road intersecting the highway. A few cars meandered past on that road, but it was a quiet town. As I was pumping gas, a scraggly thin guy walked up and started mumbling while asking for the time. I told him the time and made small talk, but not a word this man said was intelligible. All the while he was circling the car and commenting on my stuff, but again, I could not really understand his words too clearly. I made an excuse to duck into the convenience store, which I needed to do anyway, because my bike was rattling loose, and I wanted a bungee cable to secure it more firmly. As I went into the store and searched for a cable, I noticed the scraggly man had also entered, and he was now talking with the clerk. On a scale of 1 to meth, the scraggly man was about an 8.5, while she was hardly even a 5 on that scale. Much more trustworthy, while something about that guy gave me the creeps. Anyway, I found my cable, and as I approached the register, she made small talk about noticing my car was overpacked and asked if I was moving somewhere and things like that. She asked about the cable, and I explained it was to secure my bike more firmly. She then told me I should drive my car behind the gas station, and they would help me tie it up tight, speaking in the plural, implying what I had already deduced, that she and the man were associates somehow. Again, my car was just outside the window of the shop, in clear view of the main road. She told me I should drive it behind the building, where nobody could see it, for them to help me tie it up, as though that help could not be done in the normal refueling area. At this point, my get-the-hell-out meter was maxing out at 3.4 on the internal scale, so I thanked her but told her I would be okay, and then I practically jogged to my car and got in, locking the doors immediately. As I left, I watched through the window as the woman and the man were in a very animated conversation, gesturing toward my fleeing vehicle. Could I have been paranoid and misreading these people because they look like meth users? Sure, but making an offer that sketchy is not a very normal thing to do. Story 2, I was at my uncle's house in the countryside with my sister, and we were playing hide and seek. My uncle went out to buy some food for us. I was hiding downstairs in this weird closet/attic thing I found. I heard a little banging noise and got a little spooked. I then chalked it up to a small rat or something and continued to hide. I then heard a snore and a groan. I immediately got out and ran to my sister. We both sat at the door together, crying, until my uncle got home. My uncle just laughed it off and we were relieved. A decade later, an old man's dead body was found when my uncle tried to sell the house. It was revealed he had been squatting there for almost a decade, and he had written in a notebook how he was going to kill my uncle and keep the home for himself, and I think that would have happened if he had not died. Story 3. When I was 12, my family and I went to Sam's Club. Being a little jerk, I decided that I did not want to walk with my family, so I wandered around looking at clothes and books. An employee kept watching me, like staring really badly. I figured he thought I was going to steal, so I smiled at him so he knew I was not bad. He smiled back. He kept checking me out, though, and asked me how old I was. We talked about my favorite books and video games. I remember being uncomfortable but could not figure out why, because he was super nice to me. I remember wondering if he was flirting with me, but reasoned that he could not be because I was a boy. A really weird conclusion to come to, but I was 12. I genuinely thought he was just interested in my favorite video games. The conversation died down and I decided I needed to use the restroom, so I went into the bathroom. Less than 10 seconds later, the restroom door opened. The guy stood in front of my stall, even though there were empty ones. I recognized the guy's shoes as the employee's. I stood there for a couple of minutes, finished using the restroom, but really confused and kind of scared. I thought he followed me because he thought I was stealing. Then the guy held a camera over the stall door and took a picture of me. Real quick, 1 or 2 pictures of me, just standing there looking up at the camera. My pants were still on, just me, in the bathroom. Someone else came in and he immediately went to the sink and started washing his hands like he had just finished using the bathroom. Then he left. It was really creepy. I did not tell my mom anything except that the Sam's Club guy thought I was stealing, and she laughed. I realized much later that he was a predator. Story 4. I remember the day some creep tried to do something similar to me. I used to visit my aunt in Fort Lauderdale, who had 3 adorable rescue dogs, all from wild circumstances, and they were all amazing. Chico, the hilarious Chihuahua, Patrick, the lab mix who absolutely adored me despite coming from an extremely abusive home, and Zach, my grandpa's favorite wolf husky shepherd mix, a gentle but very protective giant who liked to dig holes under the house and lay in the dirt, getting his white fur completely covered. Anyway, I loved taking them on walks around the neighborhood, usually one at a time. I was probably around 8 years old. One day I happened to be walking Zach. While he was in the small drainage ditch along the side of the road that Florida has to collect water, a white utility truck pulled up and the passenger door flew open. This creepy man looked at me and said, "Get in," as he threw the truck into park. I froze, and within a split second, Zach, who I assume had not been visible from where the man was, suddenly lunged out of the ditch like lightning, coming up to about face height with me at the open door. He did not pull me over or anything, but he was snarling in a way I had never seen before. The man sped off so fast that I could not even fully process what had just happened. I will never forget it. I did not completely understand what had happened at the time, but when I got back to my aunt's house and told everyone, they were clearly shaken. That good boy saved my life, and I will always be thankful to Zach, the gentle, protective giant. Story 5. I am a biologist who often has to do fieldwork surveying unmaintained private properties in the middle of nowhere. Long story short, we found a body face up in a stream deep in a thickly wooded wetland. The body looked several months old at least. There were no clothes, no tools, no shelter, and nothing nearby to suggest who the person was or how he got there. We could not even tell race or gender from what we initially saw. We called the police and they immediately told us it was probably a missing person who had ditched his car nearby. They said they had searched for weeks with dogs, horses, and all-terrain vehicles, but did not find any sign of him. All they found was his family car loaded with cash and a handgun. They also told us he seemed to be running from someone or something, real or imagined. They were not sure. Apparently, the man did not even close his car door. He just abandoned it at a rail crossing and ran into the woods in a tremendous hurry. I later found his clothes about 30 yards up the stream bank from where the body was discovered. His pants were neatly folded and placed on top of his nice brown loafers, with his underwear and socks stacked on top. His glasses were placed carefully on top of the socks, very orderly in a neat pile. His shirt and undershirt were hanging from a tree branch above them, as if set out to dry. The entire situation still unsettles me even a year later. What disturbs me most is that he ran from his family, drove several hours from his home, abandoned his car, fought his way through thick woods and briars for nearly a mile, only to stop and carefully fold and hang his clothes before meeting his end. I look him up every now and then and still cannot find any more information about what happened or why. Story 6. Back in the early 1990s, my sister took my nephew to a playground to play. When they were leaving, she noticed a man approaching her. He was well dressed in a suit and appeared to be driving a beat-up pickup truck. He asked her if she could drive him to a gas station a few blocks away so he could call a tow truck, claiming his vehicle had broken down. She told him no, explaining that it would make her uncomfortable, but said she would gladly stop at the gas station and call a tow truck for him. He began insisting that it was only a couple of blocks and that he was already very late for work. Feeling increasingly uneasy, she said no again. At that point, he became angry and yelled at her, saying he only wanted her to take him home. She immediately left, jumped into her car, backed up quickly, and rolled the window down just enough to tell him not to worry because she would call a police officer to help him at the gas station, then sped off. She did stop at the gas station, called the police, and returned to the park with an officer, but the man and his truck were nowhere to be found. Story 7. When my cousin was a teenager, probably around 18 or 19, she and her friends went out partying often. In my country, you can legally start drinking at 16 or 18, depending on the situation, so most teenagers begin going to clubs fairly young. At that time, hitchhiking was still common, and many teenagers did it to get home or into the city since very few had cars of their own. One night, my cousin and her friend wanted to go home after being out and were picked up by a middle-aged man. He seemed friendly enough and made small talk as they drove. Suddenly, he turned onto a remote road leading into the woods. He locked the car doors from the inside, and his friendly demeanor disappeared, replaced by tension and silence. My cousin's friend started crying quietly, but my cousin stayed calm and began talking to him. She told him about her family, her mother and father, her brother and sister, and asked if he had a family too. When he said he had a wife and 2 children, she asked their names, how old they were, which school they attended, and what their hobbies were, all while he continued driving deeper into the woods. Something about that seemed to trigger him, because after a few minutes he stopped the car and broke down crying. He told them that things were not going well at home, that his marriage was falling apart, and that he was terrified of losing his children. My cousin comforted him during his breakdown and let him talk until he calmed down. Eventually, he started the car again, turned around, and drove them home, apologizing as he did. When they got out on my cousin's street and he drove away, she noticed a knife placed on the passenger seat that he had kept hidden beside him. They never hitchhiked again. Story 8. I was 11 and my brother was 4. It was late at night and we were alone. My mother and stepfather were out, along with my little sister, and since we were not his children, we rarely got to go out with them. I was watching television, and my brother had fallen asleep next to me on the couch. From the couch, you could see a large window with sheer curtains, and outside that window was a parking area. I suddenly realized there was a man standing at the window, just standing there looking in. This was before cell phones, so I could not call my mom. I tried calling my aunt, but she lived in another town, and I think she believed I was imagining things. I tried calling the police, and they said they would send someone, but they did not seem to be taking me seriously either. The man started trying to open the window, and I was completely paralyzed with fear. At some point, I realized I was shaking, and that snapped me out of my panic. I tried to shake my brother awake, telling him there was someone trying to break in, but he was sleeping so deeply that I could not wake him. By then, I was near tears and shaking badly. I could not leave my brother there, and the man was still trying to get in. As I was trying to lift and drag my brother, I heard the front door opening. It was my family coming home. It turned out they had walked right past the man, who was leaning against a car. He greeted them and asked if they had a lighter for his cigarette, and my mom later commented on how friendly he seemed. I truly feel like someone was watching out for me and my brother that night, because just minutes later, and that man likely would have been inside the house. Story 9. A friend of mine had spent the night at her boyfriend's apartment and was packing some things into the trunk of her car before driving to work the next morning. She heard a man behind her say, "Can I have one of those?" She turned around and realized the man was homeless, and she was confused about what he wanted until she noticed he was referring to the water bottles in her trunk. She gave him a bottle of water, and he walked away. She continued packing until the man returned about a minute later and started pressuring her to kiss him. She said no and tried to move away, but he kept stepping closer. She pulled out her phone and texted her boyfriend to come outside quickly to help her. The man asked again for a kiss, and she told him she had a boyfriend. At that point, he grabbed both of her wrists, pulled her closer, and angrily said that he was her boyfriend now. At that exact moment, her boyfriend came outside and pulled the man away from her. The boyfriend yelled at him and threatened him, and the man responded by apologizing and saying he did not think she actually had a boyfriend, as if his behavior would have been acceptable if she were single. The man left quickly, and my friend was so shaken that she spent the night at another friend's apartment. Her uncle is a police officer, and she reported the incident to him, but they were never able to locate the man. To this day, it terrifies me to think about what could have happened if her boyfriend had not come outside when he did. Story 10. My old bedroom is right next to the front door of the house on the same floor, so I often see people coming up to the door and can greet them easily or notice deliveries. A few years ago, we got prank doorbell visitors. A few kids ran up to our door around 9 in the evening, slammed on it, and then ran into the woods across the street. I owned some powerful flashlights, spotted them easily, and told them to get out of my sight, which they did. About an hour later, they did it again, and we heard them laughing as they ran away. We called the non-emergency police number, and it turned out an officer was already on the way because we were not the first to report it. Here is where the creepy part begins. 2 nights later, after no issues the night before, it was about 2 in the morning, and I was still awake in bed when I heard heavy footsteps approach the door, followed by loud slamming and then someone running away. I was fully awake and could tell it was much louder than the kids from before, and this time there was only one set of footsteps and no laughter. We called non-emergency again, and a patrol car arrived quickly. One officer came to our door to talk, while another checked around the house to see if someone was hiding in the yard. They explained it could have been someone attempting to break in, because our area had been dealing with burglaries where criminals knock or slam on doors to see if anyone is home. If someone answers, they move on, and if no one responds, they may attempt a break-in. They said this had happened in the neighborhood more than once in recent months. What really unsettled me was realizing that person had been standing just outside the wall of my bedroom, only feet away from where I was lying awake, and it took a long time before I was able to sleep normally again. Story 11. A friend of mine had recurring, vivid hauntings while growing up. He would often wake up with the sensation of a cold, clawed hand grabbing his legs while he slept, or come out of nightmares to find scratches on his body. He would see a well-dressed woman wandering around his house. He moved frequently while growing up, and after each move he would have a few months of relief before the woman returned and the hauntings continued. When he left for college, everything stopped. A few years later, he went to visit his sister in a completely different part of the country. The moment he stepped inside her house, he felt an intense cold wash over him and completely froze. He looked at his sister and asked if she was there. His sister nodded and said that her daughters had been experiencing the exact same things he had when he was younger. Story 12. I had a really disturbing stalking incident. It involved a guy named Chris who had significant social and behavioral issues. This happened at the apartment complex where I lived at the time. He lived in the unit below mine and would constantly comment that I looked like a male version of a famous actress every time we crossed paths. He started trying to get close to both me and my friend, which eventually led to him asking for my phone number so we could talk. I gave it to him, and at first he mostly asked for music recommendations and talked about normal things. Then out of nowhere, he made an extremely inappropriate offer involving money and a sole request. I immediately said no and told him to leave me alone. After that, he began sending me disturbing images of himself in costumes, which made me extremely uncomfortable. I told him to delete my number and never contact me again. He responded by calling me a terrible person and sending threatening messages that I do not want to repeat, but I warned him that I had saved everything and would show it to the police if he continued. Eventually, I left the state to live with my sister, while my friend Robbie stayed behind since it was his apartment. Later, I found out that Chris had created a collage of photos he had secretly taken of me without my knowledge. Even years later, he still asks about me, and my friend jokingly threatens to tell him where I moved. I know it might not sound extreme to some people, but the entire situation deeply unsettled me. Story 13. This is my first time telling this story to anyone outside my family, and it has been about 20 years, so now feels like as good a time as any. I had just gotten my driver's license and wanted to show off a little to my older sister and her cool friend. At the time, we lived in a small town surrounded by wilderness, with only logging and fishing villages scattered miles apart. It was a midsummer afternoon, and we decided to go for a drive in a mostly random direction, taking whatever turns felt interesting. About half an hour into the drive, we turned onto a wooded dirt road and suddenly everything went dark. One moment it was still bright summer daylight, not even starting to fade, and the next moment it was completely dark. We joked about how it felt like the beginning of a horror movie and kept going, but I was getting nervous because I had never driven at night before. The road kept getting narrower and narrower until tree branches were scraping the sides of the car, and the tire ruts were so deep that the car began to bottom out. I was genuinely worried about getting stuck, but too proud to admit it, until my sister's friend finally said what we were all thinking, and I stopped the car. Since I had just gotten my license, I now had to reverse all the way back to where we had turned off, which was about a 15-minute drive. With no other option, I put the car in reverse and slowly started backing up. About 5 minutes later, my sister suddenly swore, and I stopped the car and followed her gaze. Sitting right beside the road was a massive 3-story house that we somehow had not noticed on the way in. The house was clearly abandoned, with the yard so overgrown it was impossible to walk through, except for a dormer window on the top floor where a single candle was lit. As we watched, the candle suddenly went out. After the frantic and terrifying reverse drive that followed, I can confidently say that experience made me an excellent parallel parker. Story 14, I met this girl who had some very serious mental health issues. I do not know all of the specifics, but she was on income assistance and required to take medication. She decided that we were destined to be together simply because we were born in the same year. She changed her phone number 4 times to trick me into answering because I had started screening her calls. She showed up at my workplace a couple of times unannounced. At one point, she decided to run away, got on a bus, and traveled about 800 kilometers away before changing her mind. She then texted me at 3 in the morning, asking me to come pick her up because she did not have money for a return ticket, or, failing that, to send her money. As unsettling as all of that was, it still pales in comparison to what happened to one of my friends. I was actually her second choice, because she had a much stronger fixation on another guy. He lived in a shared house with several friends, and it was a common hangout spot, so they did not always lock the door. One weekday afternoon around 2 in the afternoon, when everyone was at work, she went over to the house and fell asleep in his bed without anyone knowing. On another occasion, she hid in bushes near his car with a knife, and when he approached, she threatened to harm herself if he did not give her a hug. After that incident, he filed a police report and may have even obtained a restraining order. Story 15. I was playing World of Warcraft back in high school with my buddy's younger brother, who was home alone on New Year's Eve while his parents were only a few minutes away in a different neighborhood. He was my friend's middle school-age brother, probably around 13 or 14 years old at the time, and we were in a voice chat just talking and joking while we played. At some point, he mentioned seeing someone outside his bedroom window in the yard, and he sounded genuinely frightened, but I was around 16 or 17 and laughed it off, assuming he was being paranoid. We kept playing, and then suddenly he said that someone was breaking into his house. I immediately told him to hide, and he took me with him under his bed through the headset, telling me to call his mother and explain what was happening. Knowing both him and his brother had a dark sense of humor, I initially thought he might be joking, but when he begged me to call his mom, it finally clicked that this was real. I called her right away and urgently explained the situation, and within minutes, her entire New Year's Eve gathering showed up at the house, ready to help. All they found was a damaged front door and police already responding to the area. Apparently, someone had been breaking into houses on that street, and his was next, but the police arrival scared the person off as they were forcing the door. That experience changed how seriously I listen to people, because you never know when something is not a joke. And I still remember how I slowly went from laughing to being genuinely scared along with him. Story 16. I got off work early one day and went back to my apartment to relax before picking up my boyfriend later, since we only had one car. When I arrived at my apartment building, there were 4 men standing near the parking lot entrance, one of whom I recognized as a resident and 3 who appeared to be visitors, all being loud and joking around. I carefully walked around them, but unfortunately had to pass close by to reach the entrance door, since the other entrance on the opposite side of the building often did not work. They started whistling and calling out to me, but I ignored them, entered the passcode, and kept walking without looking at them because I did not want to encourage anything. One of the men caught the door before it closed and followed me inside, staying uncomfortably close as we climbed 3 flights of stairs since there was no elevator. I had my keys out and positioned between my fingers, and I started moving faster, opening the heavy door to my hallway, just enough to slip through before it closed quickly behind me. I sprinted down the hallway to my apartment and got my key into the lock. The man forced the hallway door open and ran after me, but I managed to get inside and lock the door just as he reached it. There are only 6 apartments on each floor, and my unit is in the middle, so I could clearly hear him trying the handle as it shook while he attempted to open it. He called out, saying he knew I was inside. I stayed silent, called my boyfriend and told him to take a cab while explaining what had happened, and then called the police. They told me they could not do much since he had not entered my apartment and that he would likely be gone by the time they arrived. When my boyfriend arrived later, the men were gone. I did not start coming home early again until that resident moved out and a quiet family with a baby moved in. And I have never seen the man who tried to get into my apartment again, which I hope remains the case. Story 17. I grew up near the Great Lakes, and one night a friend and I went down to the shore to take photos of the stars. But it was completely cloudy. The lake was unnervingly still, with no waves at all, and the water looked like glass. The clouds were smooth and uniform, and when you looked out across the water, their reflections stretched all the way to the horizon, making it look like a dark, endless abyss. We were standing on a pier with only one access point back to shore, completely in the middle of nowhere. There were no other cars anywhere near ours, and around 2 in the morning we noticed a figure walking toward us. We both went silent and watched as the dark shape slowly got closer. As it approached, we could hear what sounded like its right foot dragging along the cement. Everything was silent except for that dragging sound with each step. The figure stopped about 10 feet in front of me and seemed to stare at us for what felt like the longest 30 seconds of my life. It said nothing, and neither did we. Then it turned and walked away into the darkness. The only light in the area was a single streetlight at the end of the pier, and we watched it for nearly an hour, but no one ever crossed beneath it. We were terrified to walk back in case whatever it was still nearby. And when we finally did, we moved slowly, checking the sides of the pier and the water below as we went. There was nothing there, no one at all, just the two of us, and I still cannot explain what we saw that night. Story 18. I used to live in Germany a few years ago, in a small town near Cologne. I was 18 years old and living alone, and my father had rented a first-floor apartment for me right in the center of town. The apartment was a bit too big for me, and when you opened the front door, it led directly into the living room. The door had a large glass design, so if someone stood very close to it, you could slightly see their shape through the blurred glass. One night, while I was in the living room studying, I heard a light knock at the door. I was not expecting anyone, so I asked who was there, but no one answered. A few seconds later, there was another knock, harder this time. I became very scared and tried to look through the glass where I could make out the shape of a tall man, probably in his 30s. At that moment, chills ran down my back because it was 1 in the morning, and he was silently knocking. I gathered myself and asked again, louder and more firmly, who was there? He replied that he wanted to give me money, and when I tried to look closer, I saw him holding a 20-euro bill. I asked him what he was talking about, and he said he wanted to give me money because I was beautiful. I felt extremely creeped out and told him to leave, saying I did not want his money. He kept knocking, so I warned him that I would call the police. After that, he stopped knocking, but when I carefully peeked out the window without letting him see me, I saw him standing there staring at my front door for what felt like the longest 10 minutes. I was young, alone, and in a foreign country where I knew no one, and after that incident, I was always afraid to be home by myself. Story 19. I was pregnant and living in my parents' family home at the time. I was 22, single, but had a lot of support. We shared a driveway with our next-door neighbor who rented out basement apartments to men enrolled in a government program meant to help them get back on their feet while they searched for work. The men would often sit on the stoop by the side door, smoking cigarettes along the driveway. Whenever I walked to my car, I would say hello to them, and one man who had lived there for a couple of years was always friendly. Another man, whom I will call Bernard, was often outside when I came home. He was balding, in his mid-50s, thin, and wore glasses. One day he told me he had cancer, and I felt sympathetic, wishing him well with his treatment before leaving it at that. One day, my sister noticed him standing in our backyard, peering into the window of my bedroom. My room was in the basement, so he had to crouch down to look inside. After my sister told me, I became more cautious and started closing the blinds. One day when I came home, I found a heart made of rocks placed where I usually park my car, with flowers inside it. My neighbor told me he had seen Bernard placing them there. I started avoiding eye contact and began using the front door instead of the side entrance. I was about 6.5 months pregnant and getting bigger, and I started worrying that I would not be able to run away easily if something happened. Bernard then began leaving letters in my mailbox that made no sense, signed with phrases like "Love Uncle Bernard" and "Uncle Sweetie Pie." My mother went to the police to explain our concerns and ask what could be done, but we were told they could not take action and that I should simply tell him he was not allowed on our property. I did exactly that the next time I saw him. Sometimes at night I would come home and see his silhouette on the stoop, smoke curling into the air, and I would run inside. Shortly after confronting him, I received an envelope filled with balloons that had been inflated and then individually popped. And the connection between my pregnant belly and those balloons deeply unsettled me. We went back to the police, but again they said they could not do anything. A few more unwanted gifts appeared, and I told my neighbor and the other tenant, who said they would keep an eye on things. I hated being alone and had nightmares about him watching me through the window. One day my mother and I came home to find about 8 police cars surrounding his house. The other basement tenant had found Bernard trying to leave the house with a machete and had called emergency services. We all received restraining orders and never heard from him again, but the experience left a lasting mark on me. Story 20. I once went to a concert and had to take a coach back to the center of my home city, which arrived around 3 in the morning. The taxi rank outside the coach station was empty, so I took out my phone to call a local taxi company, since this was around 2014 and rideshare services were not operating in my area yet. I was standing near the doors of the coach station, which was well lit and had plenty of staff and customers moving around inside because it operates 24 hours a day, so I felt safe enough to stay outside for some fresh air while making the call. As I was looking up a phone number, a man from the coach approached me and asked if I was trying to get home. I told him I was calling a taxi, but he started offering to drive me himself, saying it would be free. I politely refused, but he kept insisting, moving closer and gradually blocking the entrance doors to the station. Eventually, I panicked and ran as fast as I could to the nearest 24-hour fast food restaurant. Looking back, I know I probably should have told a member of the coach station staff about him, so he would not try the same thing with someone else. But at the time, I was exhausted, scared, and just wanted to get away. Story 21. In 2010, I was outside late at night with 2 friends, 3 guys all around 20 years old. We were sitting on a small playground between a couple of large residential buildings. It must have been around 4 in the morning and completely dark when we heard a noise behind us. At first we laughed it off, but then we heard another sound that made us go silent instantly. We froze, looking at each other, not knowing what was behind us. After a few seconds of complete silence, one of my friends made a whistling noise, and it was answered by one of the most terrifying screams I have ever heard. At the same time, we heard something running toward us, and without saying a word, all 3 of us took off running. Something in our minds just told us to get out of there immediately. We talked about it for weeks afterward, but over time, it faded from our minds. About half a year later, we found out that a murderer had escaped from a local psychiatric facility and was arrested late at night just a few meters away from that playground. He had been living in the forest behind the buildings, hiding there and looking for new victims. 10 years later, I still get chills just thinking about how close we were to something truly terrible. Story 22. My high school boyfriend's older brother was graduating, and his whole family was in town. So I was excited to meet them and say goodbye to my friends who were finishing school. I was 15 years old at the time, and my parents worked nights and slept during the day, so I was often left on my own. The high school was about 5 miles from my house, a walk I had done many times. I got dressed up and started walking, completely unaware of my surroundings. As I got close to the school near the parkway, a nice, newer sport utility vehicle pulled up next to me. An older man, maybe in his late 40s, wearing a suit, smiled at me and said he was the truancy officer from my school. He asked why I was walking alone and told me I could not do that, insisting I needed to get into the car because I was clearly headed to graduation, and we were going to the same place anyway. I hesitated, but I recognized him as someone who worked at the school and believed he was attending the graduation, so I convinced myself nothing bad could happen during such a short drive. Once inside the car, I immediately felt uncomfortable. I do not remember everything he said, but I remember the tone felt wrong. He kept repeating that I should come to him anytime if I needed help or wanted to talk. He said he had seen me walking home before, knew where I lived, and mentioned that he lived on the street behind mine, telling me I could come by whenever I wanted. At one point, he put his hand on my knee. Then we arrived at the school, I got out, attended the graduation and party, and that was the end of it. Years later, he was arrested and convicted for abusing multiple girls, targeting and grooming those he thought were especially vulnerable. Knowing what he did to others terrifies me more than anything, because I realize how close I came to something much worse. And even now, I sometimes have nightmares and wonder how much from that period of my life I may have pushed out of my memory. Story 23. I was staying with my family at a 13th century manor in Devon in the United Kingdom, while my mom visited friends nearby. I was about 10 years old at the time, and generally pretty calm, but the place itself terrified me. The manor had originally been built in the 1300s, burned down in the 1500s, and then rebuilt, and it had that classic creepy atmosphere with mounted deer heads on the walls, low ceilings, and a smell that reminded me of an old museum. I was convinced it was haunted. We arrived late in the evening and went straight to bed. I shared a room with my older brother and younger sister, while my parents slept in another room down the corridor. As I lay there, I grew more and more scared. The next morning, I went into the bathroom to wash my hands, looked into the mirror, and for some reason said out loud that ghosts were not real. The moment I said it, the entire mirror instantly fogged over, completely frosted from edge to edge, like condensation had appeared all at once. It went from nothing to fully covered in a split second. I panicked and ran straight out of the bathroom and down the stairs, barely touching more than a couple of steps because I was practically jumping the whole way. Even now, I cannot explain what happened. I have wondered if it was my breath, a hot tap, or my imagination, but I remember being about 2 feet away from the mirror and using the cold tap. And even then, neither my breath nor the water could have instantly covered the entire mirror all the way into the corners. No matter how I try to rationalize it, the memory still freaks me out. Story 24. I was hunting antelope in the northern part of the Red Desert and had been out there all day, at least 40 to 50 miles from the nearest highway. For anyone unfamiliar with the area, it is one of the most desolate places in the entire lower 48 states. I had not seen another person or vehicle all day. After I shot the antelope, I started walking toward where it dropped and noticed a very bright light several miles away, moving quickly across the sagebrush toward me. At first, I brushed it off, assuming it was a game warden in an off-road vehicle who had heard the shot and was coming to check my tags. I was actually a bit excited at the thought of seeing another human, and maybe even getting a photo taken with my kill. As I reached the antelope, I looked up again and my heart sank. The light was moving well over 100 miles per hour, completely silent and clearly not attached to any kind of vehicle. It appeared to be flying straight toward me. I watched as it dove down behind some sagebrush within about a mile of my position and vanished. At that point, I was extremely shaken. I crouched down, quickly tied the tag onto the antelope, and started field dressing it so it would be lighter and I could get back to my truck as fast as possible. About 15 seconds later, after tying the tag, I looked up again and saw the same light already moving away from me at incredible speed, having covered several miles in just moments. I finished gutting the antelope and then practically ran while dragging it back to my truck, my heart pounding from both fear and exhaustion. I got out of there as fast as I could and did not see another vehicle until I reached the highway. When I got home and told my wife about it, she took a photo of me posing with the antelope, and even in the picture I looked shaken, like I had seen a ghost. To this day, I have no idea what that light was, though I have since heard others claim they have seen similar things in that area. Story 25. For some context, I was 16 years old when this happened, and very naive about people on the internet. I started talking online with someone I thought was nice and charming, although I only knew them through a friend. We became fairly close online and chatted often until I started noticing toxic and unsettling behavior, like spamming me if I did not reply quickly, asking oddly specific questions, and getting upset if I spent time talking to or hanging out with other friends. Once I realized how unhealthy and creepy the situation was, I cut off all contact. I had never given this person my address or any specific location details, only the general area where I lived, and they happened to live in the same area. One day while I was out with friends, my mom called me and said that a person claiming to be my boyfriend was at our house looking for me and asking to talk. She explained that I was not home, and eventually the person left. I was shocked and went home immediately. Based on my mom's description and the name he gave, it was clearly the same person I had been talking to online. After calling around, I found out that he had been asking my friends for my address, telling them we were in a relationship, that we had a fight, and that he wanted to talk to me in person. One acquaintance who did not know the full situation gave him my address. I was terrified and stayed at my best friend's house until I felt safe. I told my family everything, and not long after that, he showed up again at my house looking for me. This time, he was met by my uncle, my dad, and several of their friends, all large men who made it very clear he was not welcome and needed to stay away. After some shouting, he left. I have never seen him again, but I still think about what could have happened if things had gone differently. Story 26. I live in a semi-rural area where it is still common to see people hitchhiking to and from the nearby city, either standing along the road or posting on the local community social media page and arranging rides with people who pass them during their commute. I have stopped to help people in the past and never had a negative experience. It became major local news when a woman stopped to help a man in a white pickup truck with a flat tire, and he tried to reach through her window and strangle her, only stopping because her brother was in the back seat and managed to break the attacker's grip. She posted a warning about it on the community page. About 2 months later, I was driving home from a swing shift around 11 at night in heavy rain when I saw a man hunched over against the wind, slowly walking away from a small sedan with its hazard lights flashing. Something about him gave me a bad feeling, and I immediately thought of the warning from earlier that year. The nearest gas station was several miles away, and the closest house with a phone was at least 2 miles down the road. I felt incredibly guilty, but I kept driving. I barely slept that night, thinking about the man I had left standing in the cold rain. About a week later, I found out that roughly 10 minutes after I passed him, the police stopped to assist. Before approaching him, they checked the car and discovered blood covering the inside of the smashed dashboard. That man had murdered 2 women after his earlier attempted attack and had stolen one of his victims' cars to avoid recognition after the warning about the white pickup was shared online. He had been walking in the rain deliberately, trying to look helpless and miserable to lure his next victim. Story 27. My younger sister has always been more sensitive to the paranormal, if you believe in that sort of thing. And while she has several strange stories, the most dramatic one happened when we were kids. She had a very typical girly bedroom with pink walls, a white dresser, and small shelves decorated with hearts and trinkets. One of those trinkets was a small music box with a spring-loaded ballerina inside. Like any music box, it had a latch on the front and had to be wound from the bottom to play. The box had not been touched in years, and whenever it was used, the music was allowed to finish before it was closed and put away. The music itself was very quiet, the kind of sound you would only hear if you were standing close to it. One night around 3 in the morning, my entire family was woken up by my sister screaming at the top of her lungs. My room was down the hall, and as I got out of bed, I could hear both her screaming and the sound of the music box playing, which was strange because it was not loud enough to normally be heard from another room. When I reached her room, my whole family was already there, standing together and staring at the floor. In the exact center of the room was the music box, open and playing loudly, much louder than it ever had before, as if it had been wound to its maximum tension. The box had been sitting on the lowest shelf, about 6 inches off the floor, for so long that there was a visible dust outline where it had rested. That outline was still there, undisturbed. Somehow the box had fallen without disturbing the dust, traveled about 4 feet to the center of the room, opened its latch and played. My sister said she woke up to the sound of the music, recognized the song, and screamed for our parents. She never heard anything fall or move before the music started. My mother picked up the box, tried shaking it, dropping it, and even forcing it open. But nothing could make the latch pop accidentally, and the ballerina did not have enough strength to open the lid on its own. To this day, we have no explanation for how it happened. It never occurred again, and my sister has never had a history of sleepwalking or moving objects in her sleep. Story 28. Several years ago, shortly after we moved into a new house, my mother experienced something she did not tell us about until much later. At the time, she said my younger brother and I were staying with our father, my sister was at her grandmother's house, and my older brother was living with our grandpa. My mom unpacked a few things, closed her bedroom door, turned on the fan, shut off the light, and went to sleep. Hours later, she woke up to frantic banging on her door and a voice that sounded like it was calling out to her. Suddenly, the door swung open, and she sat up in bed asking what was happening, but no one was there. About 6 years later, around 2 in the morning, everyone in the house was asleep except my older brother. He heard what sounded like wood being knocked over in the kitchen and assumed it was the cat. But when he checked, he saw light coming from the attic and realized the closet was on fire. He ran to my mom's room, banged on the door, shouted her name, and kicked it open, and the same scene played out as before, with her sitting up confused before realizing the house was burning. After the fire was put out, she told us about the earlier incident from years before. I fully believe her, because we were all deeply traumatized by the fire and the loss of our home, and she still has nightmares where she wakes up thinking the house is burning. She said she never told us when we were younger because she did not want to scare us. After that, we rented another house we referred to as the greenhouse, where a lot of strange things happened, and the most unsettling moment was when I was scared and decided to sleep in my mom's room, and we both watched her phone slowly slide off a completely flat surface. There is more I could say, but even that memory alone still unsettles me. Story 29. When I was in kindergarten, my family had just moved to town. My parents had gone through a very ugly divorce, and my father was behaving unpredictably, so my mom was extremely careful about our public exposure because she was afraid of him knowing where we were. That year, she took us to the old local mall to get photos with Santa, but when it was my turn to go near the chair, I completely panicked and cried because I did not really know Santa, and it scared me, which is just how kids' minds work. After winter break, I went back to my kindergarten class and saw that the school newspaper had printed a front-page story about children from our school visiting Santa. On the front cover, sitting on Santa's lap, was a little girl who everyone thought was me. There were two major problems with that. First, my mom was very serious about keeping our whereabouts private and would never have allowed that photo to be used. And second, I never sat on Santa's lap at all. The girl in the picture looked so much like me that even I asked my mom if we had gone back again, and I just forgot. My mom told me she had never seen the clothes the girl was wearing before, which made sense because I hated that outfit and always had a say in what I wore. I would never have worn a Barney shirt and corduroy crush pants like that. My mom also pointed out that our eye colors were different, mine being a darker medium brown with a slight copper tone, while the girl's eyes were more hazel with green. About 10 years later, I made eye contact with a girl at a local art walk, and we both clearly noticed how similar we looked. I was amazed that we still resembled each other so closely after all that time. I turned back to my friends and told them I wanted to find her, and the 5 of us searched the roughly 4-block area where the art walk was happening, but we never found her. I have never seen her again, but I know she is out there somewhere. Story 30. When I was a kid, there was an old dump behind the trailer park in town, and all of us kids used to ride our bikes up and down the road that led into it. Way at the back was an old shack-like house that we assumed was abandoned because it was so run down. One day we decided to go look through the windows. The house's old wooden siding was gray from age, and every board on the porch bent under our weight. It was terrifying. Strangely, all the windows were clean and none were broken. Suddenly, an old woman opened the door. She was holding a chicken with its head missing, blood running down her arm, and she screamed at us so loudly to get away that it hurt my ears. The creepiest part was how she was dressed and the strange wooden symbols hanging from the porch, which reminded me of something out of a horror movie. We all took off on our bikes as fast as we could. As we rode back down the road, huge, long garter snakes were stretched across the path, tangling in our tires. We abandoned our bikes and ran home crying. Later that day, my dad and 2 other adults went back to retrieve them. My dad said he had never seen garter snakes that long before, and joked that it was probably because of all the chemicals that used to be dumped there. He also told us the name of the woman who had supposedly lived in that house and said she was rumored to be some kind of witch. But according to him, she had been dead for 10 years. No one believed our story about seeing the old woman, but whenever I see those same 5 friends, we still talk about the snakes. Story 31. One time my friend and I went into the woods behind my backyard and my neighbor's yard, probably because there was a playground on the other side of the trees. While we were walking, we noticed something hanging from a branch and went closer to see what it was. It turned out to be one of those small toy parachutes, like the kind you get from vending machines, usually tied to a little plastic soldier, except this one had a frog attached to it, and the frog was alive. My neighbors did not have kids, and my friend was old enough that I knew he would not have done something like that. The strangest part was that the frog had to have been tied there recently because it was still alive, and it was clearly done intentionally. It was extremely unsettling. Another strange incident happened when I was playing basketball in my driveway. I threw the ball around the side of my house, went to retrieve it, and on my way back, a woman from across the street, where there was a small housing village for elderly or disabled people, walked into my driveway. She looked at me and casually said she was just checking what kind of tree it was and thanked me before walking back across the street. I did have a tree in my driveway, but it was very common and large enough to be seen clearly from far away. I still wonder what she would have done if I had not come back into the driveway and whether she was really just interested in the tree. Story 32. I grew up in a very small, very rural town in the southwest corner of California's Central Valley, far from the image most people have of California. There were places I could drive where I would be 30 miles from the nearest person. When I was 17 years old, my best friend and I decided to take his pickup truck southwest out of town, over the Temblor mountain range, and into the vast Carrizo Plains, a prehistoric dry lake stretching roughly 35 miles east to west and 10 miles north to south. Around midnight, we stopped at the crest, about 4,000 feet up, and looked out over the enormous valley. In the distance, about 2 or 3 miles away, we both saw a small orange flicker. It took us about 15 minutes to reach it, using 4-wheel drive down the backside of the mountain. When we arrived, we found the glowing embers of a fire, with no fire pit, no tire tracks, and no people anywhere. I grabbed a large spotlight, plugged it into the truck, leaned out the window, and swept the area in a full circle. There was nothing, just flat, empty lake bed. We repositioned the truck to spin the tires and smother the embers. When I lifted my head again, I saw him. To explain why this matters, at that time the area had a long and well-known history of racism, and seeing a black man in that region at night was extremely unusual. Standing just outside the passenger window was the largest man I had ever seen, black, well over 6 feet tall, muscular, and almost completely naked, except for a pair of torn denim shorts. He was staring directly at me with a wide-eyed smile that felt threatening. I screamed for my friend to go, and the truck took off in a cloud of dust. I asked if he had seen it too, and from his reaction, I knew he had. The strangest part came later. There were countless ways back into town, and we took a completely different route home, driving fast for nearly 40 minutes before reaching the outskirts. As we came around a turn on the paved road into town, the same man stepped out from behind a row of tumbleweeds onto the shoulder, still barely clothed, staring at us and slowly wagging his finger in a deliberate warning gesture as we passed. I begged my friend to confirm he saw him, and he did. To this day, it is the only truly unexplainable thing that has ever happened to me, because there was no possible way that man could have known which route we would take or arrive there before us. Story 33. When I was 10 years old, my mom usually came home from work around 11 at night, and I would always stay up late to see if she brought any food with her. One night, I was lying in bed waiting when the kitchen light suddenly turned on at exactly the time she usually got home. I clearly heard the click of someone manually flipping the light switch, since my room was on the same floor and my door was open. I hesitated to get out of bed because something felt very wrong, and the house was unnaturally quiet, and my mom was usually loud enough that I would have heard her moving around. Then the light turned off, turned back on again, paused for a moment, and turned off one last time. After that, there were about 20 terrifying minutes of me lying frozen in bed before my mom actually came home for real. If I had not clearly heard the switch click each time the light turned on and off, I would have assumed it was some kind of electrical issue, but that switch was not loose and required deliberate force to flip. My older sister worked even later than my mom, and my dad was in the shower the entire time this happened. There was no one else in the house who could have done it, and while there is probably some simple explanation, 10-year-old me had no interest in going out to investigate what was happening. Story 34, my cousin grew up in a fairly quiet town with several Mennonite churches, and especially during the 1980s and 1990s, there was not much for teenagers to do, so they spent most of their time outdoors hiking or going to the lake. It all seemed normal enough until the mid-1990s, when there were a few school assaults reported, but they were spread out enough that people were not overly concerned. That changed when the police had to respond to a murder, which eventually led to the discovery of multiple rapes and murders committed by the same person, a serial rapist and killer. Around that time, my cousin and her friend were planning to go to a movie and meet other friends one evening, around 4:30 or 5 in the afternoon during the summer, so it was still broad daylight. By a strange twist of fate, my cousin's friend canceled, so my cousin walked to the theater alone to meet the others, keeping in mind that cell phones were not common back then. My cousin made it there safely, but her friend later changed her mind and tried to meet them about half an hour later, and she never made it because that man assaulted and killed her. What is chilling is that my cousin would have been at risk whether she left earlier or later, and she later realized she had walked only about 100 meters away from the man as he was heading toward the small walkway near her school where her friend was taken. Story 35. My family and I were on vacation in Hawaii, and my best friend came with us. One evening, he and I were riding around this large resort complex that used buses to take guests between different shopping areas and sections of the resort. It was dusk, and the buses were filling up with people heading back to the main resort. We got on one bus and were casually watching a small kid in front of us play a handheld game, talking about our own childhood memories. The bus stopped and a woman got on, and she was not just beautiful, but unnaturally so, the most flawless person I had ever seen, to the point that it immediately felt wrong. She did not act like she knew she was beautiful, which somehow made it even more unsettling. What followed was terrifying. The entire bus, at least 30 people, became completely fixated on her. She walked halfway down the aisle and sat, and every single person stared at her, including people turning around in their seats, people behind her, and even the bus driver. Then people started talking, saying they needed to talk to her, touch her, or be near her. My best friend became increasingly agitated, saying he needed to get closer to her, and even the small child in front of us told his mother he wanted to touch her, while the mother nodded absent-mindedly without looking away. An elderly couple behind us repeated that they needed to get closer, and I could see the bus driver in the mirror staring directly at her instead of the road, driving painfully slowly. My friend tried to stand and move toward her, and I had to physically hold him down as he became more desperate, never taking his eyes off her. I was terrified, silently praying, avoiding looking at her, and focusing on restraining my friend while nearly everyone else remained transfixed. When the bus finally stopped at what looked like a closed underground parking structure, the woman calmly got up and walked off, and most of the bus followed her without hesitation. My friend fought me, repeating that he needed to follow her, and even the driver started to stand before shaking his head and sitting back down in confusion. We sat there far longer than at any other stop, watching dozens of people disappear into that empty garage. The few people who stayed behind looked disoriented, and my friend continued talking about her for another half hour before suddenly realizing what had happened and becoming deeply shaken. To this day, it was the most terrifying experience of my life, and I am convinced there was nothing normal about that woman or what happened on that bus. Story 36, I was babysitting my cousins and my brother, and I was probably around 14 or 15 years old. My brother was 12, and my cousins were between 6 and 10. We were at their house in a nice neighborhood on a spring day, just playing outside. They lived on a dead-end street, so it was usually very quiet. An old car drove by, looped around the cul-de-sac, and then stopped right in front of where we were playing. We all froze, wondering who this guy was. He was old, probably in his 60s or 70s. He got out of the car and started talking to us, saying that he used to hunt in the woods around there years ago.